Welcome everybody. End of a very long day of map camp, and I thought we'd have an armchair discussion with no gender, no particular purpose, but just see what happens. And so I've invited some wonderful people to come and talk with us, to talk with me. So let's do some introductions. I'm going to go around the table. So top left on my side is Mr. Dave Snowden. Dave.
Hi, Dave Snowden. I'm director of the Canavian Centre, creator of the Canavian Framework, and generally Simon and I get into too many fireside chats at the moment. So.
Yes, and normally fights with everybody else. Evan, if you don't know, well worth going and investigating. And people always ask me, where did you get this format of 3 speakers? And I'm pretty sure I pinched it from Dave, but anyway.
You did. Yeah,
there we are.
It was theft, but it's okay. Right?
Thank you. So if you enjoyed Map Camp, blame Dave. If you didn't, blame me. So moving across, I've also got Andy. Hello, Andy.
Hey.
Do you want to introduce yourself, or those who may not have heard your talk yet?
So I'm Andy. How do I explain myself in this context? I have a long background in technology and in gaming, EVE Online, amongst other things. And now I'm at Unity Technologies, working on the tech side again. And overall a long history with user-driven services, and came to mapping now a couple of years ago, and it had such immediate explanatory power for some of the things we were thinking about around EVE Online at the time that I've been interested in using it since.
Absolutely welcome. Wonderful. And thank you so much for speaking today as well. EVE Online, between you and Netflix, I think you absorb everybody's bandwidth. So just moving down on my screen a little bit, we've got Toppy as well. Toppy, hi.
Hi everyone, and I'm going to say good afternoon, although I think it's actually evening for the most part. So I'm Toppy. I'm English, as you can hear, but I actually live in Chicago. And I work for a company called Kraft Heinz. So I'm their global head of employee digital experience. And how I know Simon is that I also sit in one of his research groups, which has been fantastic, looking at mapping. So excited to be here. Hello, everyone.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. I mean, the research area we've been looking in is all about the impacts of industrialization in different spaces, the accelerant that is COVID in terms of physical isolation, the change of practices, what new forms of practices are appearing, lots of discussion about power relationships, radicalization online. I mean, it's a huge field. Now, moving slightly to my left, Damien. Hello, Damien.
Hi, Simon. Still awake.
Still awake, just about.
Indeed. So I've known Simon 10, 11 years, a long time.
More. It's a long time.
Some of you have heard this today if you've been in any of the round window rooms, but I used to sit next to Simon and spent 3 years trying to work out what the hell he did. At which point we'd both actually left. Add another 4 years, I'm now starting to sort of get it. At the time was an open source zealot. Now I'm a sheep in wolf's clothing at Google. I worked on Google Cloud, basically trying to help the water industry to modernize.
Yeah, gosh, so, we used to work back in the days of Canonical, well, obviously Canonical, but it's still going and doing fantastically well. And it was the whole, basically taking over the cloud space. Great fun, and I'm so pleased that you agreed to be a co-chair for Map Camp this year, and thank you so much for what you've done.
Brilliant to be involved. I just pity for everybody because my brain is now fried. It's been a long day.
It has been a long day. I agree. So just moving along finally, and by absolutely no means least, the ever wonderful Kat. Hello, Kat.
Hello, I'm Kat Swatell. I work at Barricade. We do continuous verification and chaos engineering. And I guess I'm probably here today because last year at Map Camp, I stormed the stage and stole Simon's microphone during the armchair discussion.
Absolutely, stormed the stage, took my microphone, threw me off the stage. No, it was great fun. It was wonderful, and you are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So We've got a Q&A section, so people can ask questions and everything else. I'm just going to throw this open, mostly because my brain has become mush. What is it for those of you who've seen other talks? What is the best bit that you've seen? What's the biggest aha moment, or as Kat might say, WTF moment that you've had from mapping? If you can put those in the Q&A and everything else, love to discuss them. Now, from my point of view, there's been a lot of focus about how maps are a secondary activity. Really, this came from the work that Rosa has done at the LSE as well, is that the maps, don't worry about making them perfect. By being imperfect representations of a space, they're actually useful. And in fact, trying to make a map perfect can actually be counterproductive. Anybody got any comments on that?
I mean, my comment is that I've told you lots of times, Simon, that I think all of my maps have ended up in the garbage. I don't know if any of them. So yeah, of course, I'm not going to spend much time making it perfect when I know that it can't be, and I'm going to throw it away or erase it or whatever the case may be, right? And then even maps that I like, and I'll send them to someone else and be like, hey, I got something from this. I have a tendency to put an expiration date on them, like they're milk or something, so that other people know when they're supposed to throw them away.
So it's not just that they smell bad, Kat, at a certain stage. You want the sell-by date. I think there's an interesting thing here, Matt, which actually relates to Max Basso, because you got mapping from Max and I got Cynefin from Max. It's a common origin between us on the iSpace. And I think, I mean, one of the things we're bringing back into Cynefin at the moment is the concept of acceptable levels of abstraction. So there's a level of abstraction at which you can sensibly share with other people. It's a kind of like a lower level and upper level. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at maps in the physical world, if I use Harvey's maps when I'm walking in the UK, they're perfect walkers maps. They're 1 to 40,000. And they get rid of anything which you don't need to know if you're walking. So you need to know about marsh and cliffs and scree, but you don't need to know about other stuff. So I think the issue on any type of map is what's the scale and what's the level of abstraction for it to create meaning. So it's not a question of completeness or incompleteness. It's a question of abstraction.
There's a fantastic quote from Gregory Bateson on this, where he says, information is a difference that makes a difference. And this I keep thinking about when drawing pictures and making maps, is that we're looking for the information that makes a difference for this particular discussion or situation. And that's why we can throw them away once we've had that discussion, because next discussion is there's going to be some other information that is making a difference for the decisions we're making or the actions that we're looking to take. And that's what I usually use to guide the zoom level that we should be at. So you can wildly mix different zoom levels, because sometimes a really tiny detail really makes a difference for the discussion at hand, whereas other systems you can just black box or ignore, right?
I was doing some work with Nora Bateson last year in Copenhagen at this time on her warm data stuff, and that quote exactly came up. Yeah, and it's the same sort of principle. And it was always the classic mistake of the DIKW pyramid, which was a disaster. You know, data, information, knowledge, wisdom is just ridiculous, right? Basic principle was if you share knowledge, data becomes information. And I think that's the question about abstraction. If you share a knowledge base, then data is informative. If you don't share the knowledge base, and it's just data, it's just noise. And that's actually the problem with understanding some of the current politics. I don't share a knowledge base, with the far right. So it's very difficult to understand the motivation, because you haven't got that abstraction layer, which enables you to interpret the material. I just thought I'd risk politics, Simon, being as you can.
Oh, sure, no, you just throw that bomb in there. Oh, dear, we're less than 10 minutes in, and it's straight down the route of this throat.
One. 12 minutes 31. That's how long it took him.
Yeah.
12 minutes and 30.
Well,
Well,
maybe
you know,
I'll offer an alternative suggestion and make it a little bit light again. And Kat, I really liked what you said about the fact that they're kind of like, how I took it was that you were saying that they're like living. In my experience, and especially in the research group, I've seen like, in my experience of a map is that it's almost like living fertilizer. And just as the body is living and it has to kind of produce and things have to die and it reinvents itself, that's how I've seen maps. So in every case, it's always kind of became something else, and then we plant it in new soil, and then it grows into something else, and then it dies and it becomes something else. So Simon, you were talking about like power. I know we originally started exploring power, then we started exploring like knowledge and the democratization of power and knowledge, and then we kind of delved further and further into like the future of work. So for me, in my experience, and my experience is probably limited versus everybody else here, maps have always been the fertilizer for the next phase, which is what I've enjoyed. So there's no need for it to be perfect. It just needs to do what it needs to do to take you to the next level.
Brilliant. I mean, it's one of the things that I've struggled with is it trying to explain to people that, you know, don't waste your time trying to make a map perfect, because it is a vehicle for conversation, discussion, and about discovering the things that you should know, probably should know, but don't know, but somebody else in that group knows. And it's the process of actually mapping it out that you start to discover the other interconnections, the other boundaries, the other interfaces that exist, which leads you down a whole new area of discovery. And what I like most about it is I often have this big sort of rail against stories, not because stories are bad, but because certainly in business and in other parts of life, we have storytellers. And so power, you're told that, people didn't believe your idea because you weren't an effective storyteller. So it's always going to be the story has a storyteller. And if you challenge the story, it's highly political because you're challenging the person. And one of the beauties I like about maps is, as imperfect as they are, you can put your story on a map and I can challenge the map without challenging you. But that creates a whole new problem, which Kat pointed to last year, which is ultimately, this is about democratization of strategy and understanding. And it turns out that a whole bunch of storytellers really don't like that idea.
Sue Borchardt, I hope I'm not misquoting her, quoted Ben Mosier today. A story is a legitimate interface. When talking about the usability of maps, I almost feel that, if you look at them as a framework with which you can insert your domain knowledge in a useful way. So it's really, again, about taking away the noise. I like that quote simply because it said, do what works to a degree. So, not a great obsession with just, is the map correct? Is it something we can put up in our wall and say that's now our strategy for some long period of time? It's really about the people who are involved in the conversation. From my domain, I'm a salesperson, often mapping 2 steps away from the person who has value, who gets value from the map, and is my customer doing something sensible with this application stack? And so I'm looking out for glaring errors that usually come out in the first 2 passes or the early exercise. We had a conversation actually with Sue, which is around the tools that we use. So I like paper and pen simply because it allows me to see my mistakes. If I pick up a map that's a few days old and I see the thing that I tried to scribble out, I understand the mistake I made in framing or looking at the problem. Whereas if you're too obsessed sort of with a clean interface, if you go straight into Miro, you don't have that. And so if you haven't yet got value from your map, it's really hard then to look back and understand why.
I can't let the comment on narrative go unanswered on that, all right? Because I think you're creating a false dichotomy. If I go back to work that Max and I did in Barcelona on a tablecloth. No, I mean, we used to work on paper tablecloths in sieges near Barcelona, which, given it's the gay capital of Spain, caused some confusion from time to time, but we survived that. And the trouble is, Max didn't drink, I did, so he always took away the tablecloths and published it, all right? But one of the things we did there was to create an extreme between a map and a taxi driver. So a map is high abstraction, high codification, so it can be shared with everybody. But if you don't understand the symbols, you lose power, you lose the ability to use the map. And the map creator is effectively abstracting the space. So there's a huge power issue in map creation. On the other hand, the taxi driver, if I take a London taxi driver, it's 2.5 years minimum before they get the knowledge. So a taxi driver is far more effective than a map user, but the training cost is high. Now, narrative is an intervention between the two. It's Polanyi stuff. I always know more than I can say. I will always say more than I can write down to extend that. So narrative is the way you actually communicate between the map and the taxi driver. And it's the stories that people tell about maps, which actually are where the power issues. This is the epistemic justice issue. Right? And if you don't address narrative, you're not addressing power. And just denying narrative doesn't work. You actually have to find ways to use narrative. Because, I mean, it's a famous phrase, homo narrans, we're storytellers as a species. That's our fundamental mechanism of knowledge transfer. It always will be. It's stories.
Interesting. I'm not going to disagree, because maps at the end of the day are a visual form of storytelling. I use the example to challenge basically the rule of stories, because in its current form, certainly within business that I come across, it is stories and storytellers. And the issue with that is that we like to talk a good game. We want transparency and challenge in our organization, but the practice is never that. It's when we mean challenge, what we mean is we want you to listen to our narrative that we've just given you, and we will challenge you on why you haven't actually put it into place.
Yeah, but I mean, stories and storytellers are the least effective form of narrative. The dominant form of narrative is a trope. Yeah. It's the overall pattern of micro stories told by many people which frame the space. So storytelling just takes place in that context. It's an assemblage, if you go back to Deleuze. And if you don't understand those patterns, yeah, then actually nobody's going to listen to you anyway. So you have to influence those patterns.
So on that note, I'm going to throw it over to Andy, because you lived and existed in the gaming world, EVE Online, which is just one enormous example of people doing storytelling, because, and more than that, they're people creating that environment and creating the stories almost within it, within that framework. Also they organize themselves into like mini corporations and have some influence over the development of the whole narrative, do they not?
Well, so it's an interesting space, because the game itself has very little narrative, or it has a thematic setting, and then the true stories come out of how players interact and how they play with each other. But I think that I actually have another sort of background which is interesting on the concept of like storytelling and narrativization. What I think happens with maps is that once you have put the information out there such that it is visible at a higher kind of fidelity than you can get with initially only storytelling, because it's less kind of information dense, then you can start making stories out of the insights that you've gained from mapping. And this type of sort of post-fact narrativization is something that happens all the time in another one of my pastimes, which is live action role-playing games, but also EVE Online, where you have these user-driven stories and interactions that when they happen, they might not actually be that sort of mind-blowing, but then when you look back and you actually retroactively create a narrative of what happened. And I think this happens with maps as well. When we have that collective process of putting things out there to be visible, you find the gaps and the insights and the new knowledge that emerges that then gets narrativized both collectively, but also individually. If you map something alone, you can find the stories that are going to work, and they might be different type of stories than the more kind of SWOT diagram type of stories or navigation stories, because they are grounded in something that is more information dense, basically. So you can go back and ask why, and then you have some richness to the information that is sort of backing up the narrative. But I think a number of people have found that once they mapped, they actually come out with one or two really powerful stories that can form the whole foundation of the company that they're founding. I think Prasanna has a number of these stories where, you know, once they've done a bunch of mapping, they find that, oh, this is the customer we're going to sell to. And then they can throw away the map, obviously not like delete it from the universe, but they found the story, they found the gap that could be filled potentially by their company. And now they can go to storytelling instead, but it grew out of a mapping exercise.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I don't know who I'm asking permission right now.
Yeah,
I
don't know why you're looking at me. I'm always wrong.
Where is Kath and what have you done with her? Right?
Yeah, so my question is, what's the difference between a narrative or a story and testimony? Because for me, I think what we've talked about before is that I have found that maps have a way of counteracting the testimonial injustice that we might encounter, right? Where there's like something about me as a person that causes my testimony to be discounted. And when I put my testimony into a map, some of that goes away, right? Whereas if I am just like imparting a story to someone, there's a high likelihood that I'll fall victim to some sort of testimonial injustice, specifically in the space in which I work, which is technology. So I'm wondering, what is the difference between a narrative and testimony?
Testimony is a ritualized form of narrative, right? Because basically what happens is the meaning is imparted with the story. It's not actually in a testimony. You're working within a form or expectation, and the meaning is therefore given by the way you tell it. Whereas in pure narrative, meaning emerges from people's interaction with anecdotal data. So I think testimony can work both ways. It can actually be it's not necessarily about epistemic injustice, because the right testimony at the right time is a way of invoking empathy. And so there are ways to handle that, right? But everybody keeps forgetting this, which is ritual is critical, because ritual kind of like determines the way that something is perceived. And if you can ritualize dissent, it's like some of the work we've done where we've ritualized, here are stories told by women in Africa who've been genetically mutilated. Yeah, you indexed it the way you thought they indexed it, and this is the difference. Yeah. Now, it's a type of map in a sense, because what it forces them to say is they index it that way, I'd index it this way. What does that difference mean? Yeah. And I think that's one of the interesting things about narrative is creating contrasts which force people to think about things or face up to things that they haven't seen before. Yeah? And I think there's some interesting other aspects. Some of the testimony on female programmers who were anonymized and then rated by other programmers compared with female programmers who were not anonymized, rated by other people. Once that data was published, which was kind of like, it was just devastating. I mean, we all knew the West Coast was misogynist and took Ayn Rand too seriously, but it kind of like confirmed it, right? So anybody who takes Ayn Rand seriously after puberty should go into a mental hospital, in my view, right? But yeah, the point is, it was a fact combined with the testimony of impact, which then had an impact, and I think the ritualization of that was key.
I'm sure it touches on your point, Dave, but for me, the difference between the two is authority. I have the authority to tell a story about my father's childhood because I may be the best person after him to talk about it. I don't have the authority to give anybody's testimony about their personal experience of something having happened. So it's not that I disagree with what you said, it's just that I interpret the two words differently, and for me the key thing
by that, but the ritual is quite scary. If you go and look at the religious right, you go and spend time with them, right? There's a ritual form of a testimony about conversion, which is actually a power issue. So effectively, the testimony is forced into a structure around the mercy seat in which you're asking forgiveness for patriarchal figures. So testimony has multiple forms, but the ritual determines the power relationship, not the testimony itself. It's the ritual around it, I think.
And I can see the subtle drawing us into the politics discussion again. But so I'm going to sidestep by saying Prasanna's just joined us. Hi, Prasanna.
Hey Simon, hey folks.
Hey,
Hey
how
Andy.
you doing? Hey, yeah, can you switch on? Well, you don't need to switch on your camera. Because Prasanna, you're a VC and you've got many different companies. How many of them are mapping these days?
So we make all of them map. Some of them take to it a little better than others. So about 48 so far.
48. And
Yes.
and how is it helping? I mean, the discussion that we've had at the moment. Anything you want to add or throw in there?
Right. So the interesting thing that we've seen is exactly what Andy was saying, right? So which is that for somebody to start mapping, they need a reason. So we use a story for them. Hey, one of the previous founders did mapping and they got something out of it. And this is the kind of thing that they got out of it. So this is why you should do it, right? Because otherwise they don't want to put in that effort. So that story says, okay, I'll invest my time and effort into building this map. And then they build the map, and then typically they end up finding something that actually they were not looking for, which is like Andy said, maybe I should be serving this customer persona and not that customer persona, or maybe I should be solving this problem because it has a higher value than the other problem, or maybe I'm doing things which are commodity and 100 others are doing, but I am better at selling magic. Or vice versa, I'm trying to do something that's magic, but I don't have technology people who can make magic, but I'm very good at selling commodities. So maybe I should build something that's commodity. So that is what the map helps all of us get to the same landscape. So we're all talking about the same thing, and we're all not talking about different things. And the example that I had given a little earlier was we had a HR software company which was selling a skill assessment tool. One co-founder was thinking about selling it to a hiring manager who the tech person reports to. And the other co-founder is thinking about selling this to the HR person who's hiring hundreds of people, but is absolutely non-technical. And before we mapped, both of them were thinking we're selling the same thing to the same person. But the stories that they were telling each other around that selling were completely different, because obviously the HR manager doesn't care about how good the test is. They just want something that will get some people hired. Versus the hiring manager cares that the person that they're hiring is actually good at that particular skill. And so this was the conflict. And once they mapped it, they realized, oh, okay, so these are two different things. And then when they take this map and go outside to create partnerships and things like that, they first have to tell a story around that. Hey, why should I partner with you? They have to tell a story. And then when they show the map saying, this is why we told you that story for us to partner with, there's like, oh, okay, now it makes sense, right? So both of these work together. And the last session with Ben and Kat and Farah was like pointing to this, right? So you can't use the map alone. You can't use the narrative alone. When you lead with the narrative, that's what creates the emotional resonance for a lot of people to then continue listening to you. And then you follow up with the map so that now when they are engaged, the map actually shows them why it makes sense. Otherwise, I'm fairly good at creating a reality distortion field. So I can say things which in that moment people will tend to believe. But then you walk away and the magic is gone. And then an hour later or a day later, it may no longer make sense for them. But the map both as a logical construct that all of us can agree on versus the story as something that's there and not there. And the map as an artifact that they can hang on to and make more meaning out of subsequently. I think that layering has helped a lot of our startups.
Hey, Prasanna, I really love what you're saying, because I'm reading the Q&A and the chat that's coming through, and I'm realizing that maybe a way I could describe a mapping, which is relatively similar to the route that you're taking, is that it's almost like when you journal. You know, sometimes when we have thoughts and we never complete our thoughts, we kind of never finish the sentence or we never finish the rhetoric until you write it down. It doesn't have meaning. sometimes if you've experienced something in the day, you can be stuck in a cycle, and until you kind of document what's happened and write it in a journal, let's say, it doesn't really make sense. And the way you're describing mapping, for me, it feels as though you're describing like a play. That of course, when you act the play, you put your emphasis on it, and actually maybe at certain times you may change certain parts of the script. But what actually helps like a play be repeated over and over and over again and kind of go on through history is the fact that it's been written down. But then the expression is the thing that brings it to life, and you can't have one without the other. In essence, actually, what you're trying to do is write the corporate play that can be told over and over again with your different characters and the different, I don't know, activities and the different personas and the different personalities.
Correct. And we talk a lot about founder market fit. So, you know, depending on where the component is in the map, you have to make sure that you are the right person to play that game. And a lot of founders have come back and told us that, you know, that founder market thing made us choose this game rather than another game, because we realized we are good at selling magic, so let's sell magic. But for that, we have to build magic. So let's get everybody onto this part of the map so that we're all playing the same game. Was like really a very interesting way, which comes back to your analogy of, in a play, you have to have the right character to play the right role. Otherwise, it's not going to work out if you put somebody who doesn't fit the part.
Wow, fascinating. I mean,
Paul
really.
Promise. Oh, sorry. Go on, Simon.
No, please, Damien.
I was going to read just from the chat because it was just so on point. By writing something down, you also make it easier for people to agree or disagree. So who's ever done that thing where you're happy to say something, but you're not happy to have it written in a repeatable form? People are going to say that to you. So there's a value. I mean, I think it's to what Simon said right at the beginning of the talk. But yeah, I agree with that. Thank you.
And, you know, as I'm thinking of storytelling, the power of a storyteller, and I think we've all kind of alluded to it, is that you almost read your audience, right? So you have, this is the script, this is the rhetoric, but based on your audience's response, you may choose to neglect or emphasize certain elements. You know, the brain is fantastic for reinventing like the truth in history. I actually didn't, when you kind of like study the psychology of people, there's a lot to say that we don't tend to remember things in exactly the same way it occurred. We remember it as the last time we kind of told the story or we thought about it. And that's what a storyteller does, right? That's the power of a storyteller. You read your audience and you respond to your audience. You kind of like manipulate your audience. Whereas a map, that's why I really love it, because we've been talking a lot about like this democratization of power and knowledge, especially in this virtual space. And what does that mean in my space, in my world, which is like the corporate environment? And mapping kind of makes it very clear and obvious. I can't overemphasize anything. I can't underemphasize anything. It is what it is at that moment in time.
So what's the difference between a map maker and a storyteller? What's the power difference between somebody who makes a map and chooses what to represent and a storyteller who chooses what to emphasize? What's the difference?
So I'm going to point to Sue's comment online. Sue said, if Simon wasn't such a compelling storyteller, I would have no interest in strategy and basically my form of mapping. So you know, there I am, caught. Thank you, Sue. My own hypocrisy exposed, because I use storytelling to persuade people of the interest of not using storytelling. But there we are.
Dave, I think your push is fair though, because I would say a storyteller probably has the ability or the flexibility to kind of reinvent the story with every single breath. Whereas with a map, you have to physically do something, right? And you can only do it as quickly as you do it. So to be honest, I probably can understand inside to some extent with your push there, like where is the real difference between the two?
And a storyteller can respond to changes, whereas the map has a lifespan. There's a famous quote from Orwell, though, which we should bear: "A story is a lie, you see." I mean, and that's the whole point. And it's the point you made earlier. We don't remember things the way they happened. Human beings don't do that. We remember things retrospectively to justify our current position, which is why all the lessons learned programs in companies are a complete and utter waste of time, and always have been.
Wow.
Gosh. We did experiments on this in IBM. We took sales teams, all right, and we got them to do a lessons learned process the day before they knew whether they won the sale or not, and the day afterwards. Yeah, script-based facilitation, so no variation. And you would think you were on different planets, right? So people don't remember things. It's called conceptual blending. There are chemicals in the brain which break up memory patterns, so you never remember anything the same way twice. Which actually has evolutionary advantage. That's Walter Freeman.
I was going to say the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's fundamental. I mean, Freeman is brilliant on this stuff. I mean, what he did by chaining up rabbits to prove it is pretty bloody cruel, but that's cognitive neuroscience for you, right? So, you know, one of the issues is you have to capture stories in the field under fire as they happen, because that's the only authentic data, and then that you can create maps from. Anything which is retrospective is determined by the power relationships of the present.
Interesting. Gosh, what do I say to
But
that
it
one?
still does help. I mean, Dave, I actually really agree with you, because my background is tech, my background is psychology.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. However, I do also see the power of storytelling, and even more so the power of a map, because in a moment in time, going back to this idea of it being like fertilizer, it serves a purpose at a moment in time, and it's allowed to die and regenerate and become something new in the future. I understand the evolutionary advantages of kind of not remembering things, and that's why like women have more than one child, right? But the reality is you kind of need the story, you need the map to serve the purpose at the time, knowing that it is finite, knowing that it will regenerate and become something else in the future. Otherwise, how do you move forward?
And there's something Simon and I keep talking about doing, but we haven't done what we need to do, which is to automatically generate a Wardley map from people's narrative in the field. Yeah, so our use of SenseMaker, which generates self-interpreted narrative, yeah, which is an epistemic justice issue, if your interpretation counts, can we use that to automatically generate a map? Yeah, so a mass culturally diverse, and that's something we talked about a few times and we haven't done, and I think we should do, because if the generation of the map is actually generative across a culturally diverse group, then that's very different from an individual doing a map.
Fascinating idea. I mean, particularly since the Axis.
Right. We set Steve Perkins the task, and he's just confessed that he's still thinking about it.
Well, the axis and the basis of the maps is derived from publication types anyway, so it is based upon.
It should be easy to do. Yeah.
Relatively easy, but
on story versus maps, right? If we think about what we're doing when we get together with a group, most of the times it will be stories that inform where you put components down. So it will be the finance person explaining the impact of that particular change to me. So I'm always thinking, well, maybe stories humanize maps, whereas maps take away the subjectivity of stories. Because you have to agree on what is it that a story that someone has just given really means and what's its impact on the map. But effectively, really, it's just a representation of the collection of stories that you've got.
I think that there are two layers of what we're talking about here, because I think that any technique that helps humans externalize things so that they're easier to collaborate on, like you can do that in many ways. I think at least you can write things down. You have Amazon has this like 6-page memo process. You have the A3 process with put stuff on an A3 paper and walk around with it. You have whiteboarding, you have architecture diagrams, you have all kinds of methods for just helping people collaborate by externalizing something. I think that my experience, and stories play into that in different ways, but I think my experience for what's really unique to me about the Wardley maps is really the idea of evolution. Like that is the truly opinionated part for me about mapping, is to say that this is a hugely powerful way of understanding what happens in the world. And what you're really doing is placing existing knowledge, you're externalizing in that particular context, right? And that is like, I mean, without that, you're sort of just, it's like any whiteboard exercise, right? Like that particular context for me, that's the deep power of Wardley mapping. the rest just applies to any method for externalizing knowledge and putting it, on a whiteboard.
I'm going to
guys
say, well, and I'm biased, so I'm going to agree that I think and what I'm going to say is otherwise it's just a network diagram. A network diagram of connections, and we've had those for some time. What they were missing, it's like when I'm looking at supply chains or whatever, is any formalization of anchor, any formalization of position, but to some extent, they are not quite as important as the concept of consistency of movement, and that's the evolution axis itself. Well, I'm biased because I've been using them for 15 years, so I'm going to say that. But I am looking forward to the day that somebody creates a better form of mapping, because these are very, very primitive instruments. But just simply, I use them because they're better than what I had beforehand, which was just nothing more than network diagrams. At that point, I managed to have killed the wonderful flow of conversation. Shows you how useless I am.
I've just realised why you want to get us off politics. You're still ashamed of supporting Brexit.
Oh, here we go.
I've just realised that's the reason.
Really? Well, look. So we can't avoid the discussion.
Sorry about that. I couldn't resist it. All right.
Well, we can't avoid the discussion of radicalization going online. I mean, here's my attempt to deflect. I mean, Kat did a wonderful.
How Simon supported Boris. Is that the story we're about to tell?
So deflecting, Kat, we had a wonderful discussion early on about the whole sort of power relationships and radicalization. And one of the interesting things, of course, we now live in this post-truth world where it's interesting because if you look at, from a government perspective, there's two ways of controlling people. One is to do good stuff and educate people that you've done good stuff. And the second way is to manipulate perception and behavior. And the problem today is it is now so cheap to manipulate perception and behavior. It's very, very questionable why any democratic system would go about trying to do good stuff and educating people, because that's really expensive. If you want to retain power, just manipulate people and manipulate their behavior, because all the systems are there to do it. Do you, Kat, is that an unfair characterization of where we are?
That is not unfair. However, I think you are intentionally being antagonistic and taking a really narrow view, right? So cheap implies that it's a transaction, right? And so I'm conducting a transaction with this individual human here, right? That I have these tools available to me, and it is very cheap to influence the way that they think about the world or the action set that they consider to be available to them, right? That's cheap to influence. But if we were to consider society as not an aggregate of transactions, but as a whole thing with its own characteristics, then is that actually cheap? Right? Like if we take as an example, healthcare in the United States, the cost of providing healthcare in the United States is astronomical, right? It is much more expensive as a system than other places, right? To get healthcare in other places. So it could be really cheap to convince an individual human that they should feel this way or that way about healthcare, about being healthy, about just care in general. But as far as when we look at the cost, if we're going to use that, which as you know, I would prefer not to, but seeing as that's the frame you're taking, fine. If we look at the cost, right, of providing this or of just being as a community or a society or whatever, then it's not cheap. So that's kind of where I land on that.
Yeah, but we have a term for that. We call it externality. So we can just put our fingers in the ears and go, la, 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 we don't care. We're ignoring those sorts of things. And of course, Facebook doesn't sell data. Facebook sells behavior.
I'm sorry, did you say term or turd? It wasn't clear for me.
Okay, term. Yes, I do understand the term externality itself. I mean, you know, that's just the way we bundle up all the things we can't properly account for, as we like to say it.
Some of those things are impossible to account for. Sorry,
and they're
Dave,
critical.
I'm talking over you, but they're impossible to account for in terms of individual transactions or an aggregate of transactions, right? Yeah. So it causes, you must adopt two frames simultaneously if you're going to use cost. Then you have to be thinking about transactions and also like the, you know, whatever carrying costs for us as a society.
So the transaction language is the problem, right? The minute you talk about,
you're telling me
the means of exchange and control of the means of exchange becomes power. There's no reason, if we took a gifting approach, that we shouldn't provide free at the point of entry healthcare and education worldwide. It's just we choose to ration it with money. Yeah. And therefore control with that money gathers. And that's where power happens. We've got to stop the language of transactions. It's dangerous.
So Kat explains it as the ethics. Well, Kat, I'm not going to explain what you explained to me. That would be mansplaining.
David is just like intentionally.
You tell me.
David is over there like picking away at me right now. I can tell.
No, because your stuff is wonderful. So
yeah. No, that is fundamentally, speaking of turds, I don't love that, right? Like just because the same thing is provided, right? If we're framing things as transactional and as choice and extractive, so you can provide healthcare within that paradigm, right? And you can provide healthcare within an ethic of care, right? Mm-hmm. But just because the same thing is being provided does not mean that here we have a transaction, right, where it's like an equal exchange of value or whatever, and then we also have gifts. No, care is something fundamentally different, right? Like you will be oriented towards different outcomes depending on whether you're providing healthcare in a paradigm of choice or you're providing healthcare in a paradigm in an ethic of choice. So you'll be oriented towards different outcomes, right? Like through choice, you'll be oriented towards providing people the information that they need in order to make informed choices. I don't know what that means. You can't be fully informed on any choice. But in an ethic of care, we're going to be oriented towards producing outcomes that are right for the person and right for our collective.
I mean, that's that ethic of choice versus ethics of care gets the very heart of this whole me versus we discussion and framing that in a much better way than I could. I mean, I think
I didn't come up with it.
Oh, didn't you?
No. There's a whole body of research around like the ethics of care and the logic of care, and there's, you know, whatever, a whole bunch of like crap pseudoscience, I guess, around the ethic of choice. That's my personal opinion anyway. But I mentioned Carol Gilligan in my talk earlier, who kind of like wrote the thing on care, right? And then the other, for me, that's because I'm very analytical. You know this about me, right? So I really like Carol Gilligan's work, but also I'm like, this doesn't hold up when you examine it from a place of science, right? But I really like Anne-Marie Moll also for framing like practically, what does this mean in practice, right? So what does it mean to adopt choice or adopt care in practice in the world? So those are two people that I really like.
So Damien, We used to sit together. You were always the salesperson. You were always the better storyteller between the two of us. So how do we shift the entire society using maps from an ethics of choice and transactional basis to an ethics of care?
Last sentence, a phone rang right in front of me and I got taken out. How do we switch?
How do we switch society in general using maps from an ethics of choice, where it's all transaction, it's all about the individual, it's all about maximizing choice and extraction, to an ethics of care?
Well, so the first thing is, I don't think, we switch it back. So we have spent a long time building and industrializing mechanisms that ignore care as part of it. You ask, I have a lot of family who work in the NHS, my mom, my aunts, but a hell of a lot of them, and it's the fact that it was this, I suppose, ethos of care that took them into that work, not that it was the thing that they wanted to do or is something that they planned for as a career choice. It was just the thing that most sort of represented their values. And really, when we talk about the business space, when we talk about the way we have architected society over the last 60 to 150 years, we'd really say that that's it. We've not really factored the pillar of care into the things that we're doing. So for me, it would be using maps would be showing that to people. So sometimes the very people who are victims of a process who have suffered most are the least aware of what's happened to them. So it's that we would use maps to expose the lack of focus on care and the impact that it has on people, where that isn't obvious.
Did we just come full circle all the way back to epistemic injustice, right?
Well, we have, yes. We're just.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
There's a competition here because Prasanna is basically your competition for quote of the day. So, Prasanna, are you still awake?
Yes, very much.
Good. Have it up.
I think we just came back to hermeneutic injustice, right? Where people don't even have the language to tell a story about how they have been denied care or how they have been marginalized by the outcomes, the externalities or whatever of an ethic of choice.
So one of the fantastic bits in there is, because often the response is, well, we'll just have a gift culture, but that makes it transactional again.
Yep.
It just reiterates the problem.
Gift cultures work. Gift cultures are not transactional. A gift is a ritual which brings you into a community, which then takes your responsibility for you. It's not an exchange with an expectation of equal return. That's the key. Yeah, it's a very different process.
Okay. Any comments on that one?
So I'll sidestep that and then come back to the part about using maps or using stories to move from choice to care. It depends on who you're selling that story to, right? So if you had selling to somebody in power, then you have to use the tools that they are used to believing in order to shift them from the choice that they made to use choice to care. At the same time, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand that story, who doesn't have that power, and they don't have the tool to even understand the map that you are building, then you cannot use maps to communicate to them. So for me, the relationships that are shown on the map that you will create to move from choice to care, different people are there in different parts of the map, and they need different ways to understand that map. And I can't go to a think tank, a purple or a right wing or a red or a blue think tank and try to sell them narratives. They're not going to buy that, right? I might need a 30-second narrative to get them to listen to me for the next 15 minutes, but they need something on paper with lines and words and something that they can put their trust in,
Prasanna, you're such a terrible sport. I think you're marvelous. But you've just told me that in order to shift from an ethics of choice to an ethics of care, I've got to go and persuade the one group of people who benefit from the ethics of choice.
Yes.
It's like we want to make things better by taking away your power. That's not going to work.
Yes.
They're just going to say, well, it's just cheaper to manipulate people and their perception rather than doing all this good stuff and educating people. Andy, there must be something in the world of gaming. Surely EVE Online, we had evil empires. How do we combat and make them nice to each other, or are we just doomed?
I'm not sure you'll find so many answers in gaming here. I mean, play itself is, of course, an interesting concept, and the concept of humanity and culture and gift culture and overall care and so on. I mean, play and the kind of magic circle around it has some very special properties, and I think that maybe play is how we can evolve as humans. There might be maybe some learnings in games, in the sense that you can use it as a laboratory for basically using the power of the magic circle of a playful experience or a game type of setup. You can construct new realities, try them on to some extent. You cannot erase the bleed between the real lived lives of people playing and the play. I mean, the magic circle is a permeable border, but it does create some potential space for change that is maybe not accessible in other contexts. So
it's an interesting work here we did on gaming within the Singapore military. Klein and I ran the process. If you set up a game where people are doomed to lose successively, after 3 rounds of failing to win, they scan 20 to 30 times more data before they make a decision. Right, now that's actually quite significant. I mean, that's human games masters managed in that position. If you can put people in position where they successfully fail, that's where you can achieve change. Okay. And you can start to see that on the political side. If you get a successive failure of trying to deal with COVID and you just keep throwing money at it, constant failure opens up more possibilities than actually success, because that entrains you too quickly. And I think this is one of the interesting things. I'd be interested in what you think on this, Andy. This is one of the things we're looking at on game paradigms. Games which are designed to allow people to win actually have less learning than games that are designed to empower people to lose. And I'm now revealing my youthful obsession with Star Trek. It's coming through big time on this. But stop looking at that like that, Cat. You know that. Yeah, it's a.
Andy,
I know the game you're referring to.
Yeah.
To Andy, so a question came up earlier, and it's just brilliant timing. It was from Simon Clifford. How we can get the police to start thinking in the way a criminal does, right? And he was talking about mapping, but seeing as we're talking about care and you're talking about games, I see a connection there that I think you could comment on.
I'm not sure. I have opinions about police, so I'm not sure this is going to go well.
No, maybe that's not fair. So, I think to understand the context he meant it in, I just thought games could play a part in that because of the fact that, again, you're constrained, but it certainly informs the care question.
I guess you can do all kinds of stuff there, but I'm really interested in what Dave just said about how humans learn, basically, and how we evaluate data and try different things based on success or failure. And there's so much interesting stuff going on in actually movement science right now. And I'm learning about it through a strange angle, which is someone I've got to know in tech, which is Kathy Sierra, who is now doing movement science work with horses. But where it all connects, right, is that with movement, you have a complex system that adapts to its environment and reads sensory input and has proprioception about where are my body parts and what can I do with them. And this example of basically when you're failing, you start reading much more data is exactly the same types of patterns that can happen. And some of these patterns of how the brain works with movement as well is that you can have perceived, if you perceive that something's going to be painful, the body will constrict movement, although there is nothing mechanically wrong with the limbs. And you can think of you have some social mechanisms that are similar. Like what they've discovered now is that pain, you know, it's a system in your brain that's trying to preemptively protect you from being harmed. It's not like a direct link between like tissue damage. So it hurts more if a stranger squeezes your finger than if a friend does it with the same power. There's some super fascinating stuff here. And
I'm going to have to dive in here because this, you know, it's 8 o'clock now, and this is so fascinating. It's going to be 10 o'clock before you finished, but actually the event was over 2 minutes ago. So this has been wonderful, and I just want to continue this on. But in terms of where we've gone and everything else, you know, I've had a wonderful day, really interesting discussions. I mean, we've sort of arrived at a sort of conclusions of the criticality of the ethics of choice versus the ethics of care. I think Manish, who put a question, is adopting a way of manipulation to achieve desirable outcome a sustainable choice. To some extent, we're going to have to learn how to, because we're being gamed in the system. So we've got to somehow game the system to actually learn how to do good stuff for us. But on that note, I'm going to say it's been a wonderful day. Thank you ever so much for coming along and speaking and being involved. I know all the videos are going up onto YouTube and should do over the next couple of days. I just want to say thank you to all of you, and also thank you to all the people who've waited and been involved, attending and listening to talks and asking questions. And thank you for making MapCamp 2020 what it is. And hopefully see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, folks. Bye.